Hello, Instagram. Welcome to Fascinated with Fungi Live. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Lorelle Sherman, better known as Lorelle Morel. She is a fantastic ecologist, educator, forager. She's sort of a Renaissance woman. She does a lot of things. She cooks and teaches and has recently sort of started an educational platform where she's leading classes and helping people get more connected to the natural world. And I'm really excited to talk to her. I've met her in real life. I think she's really cool. And again, the genesis of this whole live thing is really just because I'm kind of bored in quarantine and I like talking to people that are interesting. So hopefully you guys will enjoy what we chat about. And I'm going to get Lorelle on the horn right now. So cool. There. So fingers crossed this goes well. My Wi-Fi's been a little sketchy, but there you are.
Hello.
Hi. Hello. Sorry for the delay there. I was dealing with technical things that were.
Yeah, no worries. And I think you're pretty cool too, Gordon.
Oh, thanks. So hi. Yeah, I guess we chatted briefly yesterday, but there's sort of a whole bunch of things that I wanted to ask you, and I was like, I'll wait till we have a chance to kind of discuss them and flush them out fully. But just, I guess, to give people a little bit of background on where you're coming from, you went to UVM, which I think is great because I went to UC Santa Cruz, and UVM and UC Santa Cruz have a lot of So, oh, there's Jerry. And Jerry. So yeah, what was your experience at UVM like, and like what led you to want to go to grad school and sort of learn more about the natural world?
Oops. I'm just going to let you know there's a little bit of delay on my end. I'm not sure if that's part of the technical difficulties we were having earlier, but
probably
we'll just roll with it.
Just roll. Yeah, I was just asking you what UVM and had inspired you to sort of pursue getting a graduate degree in like ecology and learning more about the natural world.
Yeah, definitely. So University of Vermont is in one of the most beautiful places in the country. Burlington and Lake Champlain are just absolutely gorgeous and full of natural wonder. So it's hard to not be motivated to spend a lot of time in the outdoors there. And so I actually went there because I am a skier and I wanted to be close to the mountains and at a school that had a good biology program. So it's one of the main reasons I was there. But I kind of met up with a group of PhD naturalist students that were doing walks for the community, free walks that just led people around the local parks and taught local plants and ethnobotanical uses. And I got super hooked and got really involved with the group and started leading my own trips there. And so that UVM actually kind of launched me into the foraging game. And I actually took many years off before I went to get my master's degree. And I worked a job that was doing more environmental education type stuff. But I'm one of those people that's always known that I wanted to be a wildlife biologist or a forest ecologist, I suppose.
Well, that's
just from a really young age. And so I never changed my major, and it was just always in the back of my mind. And I kind of went a different route for 5 years, but then, something deep within me, I guess, was like, it's time. We're going to go.
Yeah, it's funny that
biology path.
Those childhood experiences that you have will sometimes well up in very interesting ways as an adult and, catalyze you to pursue something that you wouldn't have necessarily thought you were going to do. But I mean, clearly, I think you had a deep passion for it. So it's good to see you doing what you love.
Yeah, I, in preparation for this, I was just kind of thinking about what got me into foraging, and I remembered a time when I was very young and I would collect plants and bring them home having no idea what they were, and I didn't know, but I had brought back a whole bunch of poison hemlock and put it under my bed, and it just rotted there, and it was the worst smell ever. But I know now that it was poison hemlock because now I recognize the smell of rotting poison hemlock,
and you have that
wow,
exact smell memory.
Yeah.
That's a hoot. Did you have the same proclivity for like just eating random leaves as a child that you have now? Because your videos of just eating stuff off of trees and things always like
I do remember doing stuff like that, which is why I'm pretty scared about the fact that I had poison hemlock in my hands. But yeah, I was definitely no, I've never been afraid to taste test things and spit them out often, but yeah.
Yeah. And that's a pretty good thing. That most things in life you can probably take a bite of, and if it doesn't taste good, you can spit it out. Because that's we as human beings evolved to kind of figure stuff out like that. That's why we have, hundreds of different bitter receptors, because we are so keyed into, sweet and sour are pretty simple. We have like one or two receptors for each flavor, because that doesn't tell us a lot about a food, whether or not it tells us if it's ripe. But bitter tells us so much information about what's there, because there's so many different compounds that we can taste as bitter, and that's sort of telling us, hey, this might not be a good thing to eat,
Yeah.
from a natural perspective. So,
Yeah, definitely.
so what led you? Yeah, what led you to grad school? What led you? You kind of came out of UVM with this sparked interest, and where did you go from there? And what were some of the things you worked on in grad school?
So like I said, I took a break and I did a lot of environmental education before grad school, which has kind of launched me into where I am today. I worked with K through 12 city school kids and pretty much just got really interested in inspiring others to get inspired by nature. But then when I decided to get back into the world of science, I really missed researching and spending all night reading papers. So whenever I went back to grad school, I knew I wanted to work with birds. I am a bird nerd, self-proclaimed bird nerd. I've always been a bird watcher. I lead bird guiding trips. So I kind of chose my project based on that. And I volunteered and was a technician on several bird research projects before I decided who I wanted to work with. And so I ended up working with Dr. Joan Hagar at Oregon State University. And she was doing a project on the purple martin, which is a swallow species. Are you familiar with that one, Gordon?
No, it's a cool name.
Yeah, so I would highly advise everybody Google image searches this bird because it's gorgeous.
I'm
It's
gonna
like
do that
this,
now.
yeah,
Purple
navy
martin.
bluish purple. It's really boisterous, flashy. They're a cool species.
Ooh, they are pretty, yeah.
Yeah, real shiny and everything. And their song sounds like Star Wars sound effects.
And there's some like the male versus the female. The male's a little flashier looking than the female, who's a little more normal, sort of swallow looking. Okay, yeah.
Yep, definitely. The female's just a little bit drabber for more camouflage purposes. But yeah, so, doing a single species study is a little bit weird. But I kind of learned to frame it as a species that represents a really larger group of species. And so, a lot of us are familiar with old growth habitat, old growth species, the spotted owl. But in the past several decades, we've largely forgotten about the entire group of species that depends on disturbance and post-disturbance habitat. So the kind of the lack of a forest after a big disturbance like a wildfire or something. And so a lot of these species have been in peril because we've been focusing on protecting old growth, which is fantastic and absolutely necessary. But we stopped cutting on public lands, cutting trees, and we have been suppressing fire since the 1930s. And so our forest structure has changed dramatically and shifted more towards highly managed forests, or the non-managed forest being like a later, older successional forest type. And so these young, brand new post-disturbance habitats were really rare and still are somewhat rare, but they're kind of more, we kind of realize their importance now, and there's a lot of effort going towards figuring out how to bring that back. It's called early seral habitat, but yeah, so this one species is a great representative of early seral or post-disturbance habitat. And in conserving this one species, you're undoubtedly creating and improving habitat for hundreds of other species that depend on this post-disturbance habitat.
So it's not necessarily like a keystone species, but it is certainly an indicator of a lot of other things that would be going along with this. So if there's a healthy population, you can be pretty sure there's a bunch of other things that are
exactly
working in parallel.
And that bird is a insectivore. They only eat insects. So that means that if they're there, there's a lot of insects. And if there's a lot of insects, that's a good clue that there's a lot of other species around who use insects as a food source or just the insects themselves. So yeah, it's kind of a representative species, maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, you got, and I know certainly from doing like a certain particular organism, when you go into grad school and focus on that for a couple of years, you can feel a little bit like you have blinders on, even for the rest of your life, because it becomes sort of all consuming. And the idea of like trying to get data and publish and move that stuff forward in academia is it's a slog. And there's not a lot of immediate feedback. It's mostly things that you're doing. You're saying, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? Maybe at the end of a couple of years, you finally publish, you say, oh, that's why I did it. That's great. I love that it finally crystallized. But compared to something like social media, where you can like make a cool dinner and post a picture of it and people are like, hey, that looks great. And you're like, yay, I like feedback. But it's a lot harder going through academia. So I certainly have a lot of respect, because you are a published author. You have, some of this work that's been put out there. So
yeah, I'm curious. I know you work with yeast. Are you working with a broad array of different species, or do you find yourself in a situation like me where you're kind of super narrow focused?
I was certainly super narrow focused on Saccharomyces cerevisiae, because that was sort of like, that's the main organism that's doing your alcoholic fermentation. But I was lucky in some ways that there was some ecology to the fermentation, because I wasn't doing beer, which is like very sterile and always the one strain of Saccharomyces that you put in there. I was lucky in the sense that there was many different strains of Saccharomyces that we were working with, as well as even things that are sort of like weird overlaps of species. So there's Cerevisiae and there's Bianus, and there's a bunch of these different yeast species. And when you start looking at them, you realize that they're all kind of intermixing, and that the whole concept of a species in fungi and yeast is kind of a misnomer, because they love to just like switch pieces of their genome around and like do duplications and all sorts of other weird stuff. But I got a lot of input too from some other yeasts like Brettanomyces, which is a cool spoilage yeast, and a bunch of this like host of different bacteria and things like that. So there was some kind of cool ecology. And that was one of the things that made me, when I got into mushroom hunting, realize that there was more going on in the woods than I had thought there were. Because on a microbial level, you get this succession of things. And I started to understand it in a fermentation. But when I went into the woods, I was like, holy cow, there's all these relationships out here that I have been ignoring or not paying attention to, the succession of trees or flowers or things through seasons and years. And I guess I'm curious, because you are, I think, a much more accomplished ecologist and resident of the forest than me. But are there some sort of cool relationships that you see when you walk around your habitat that people might not necessarily key into?
Yeah. So I was trying to think about things that relate to fungi for this one. And so the species that I studied in grad school and many other species are called cavity nesters. So they nest in cavities in mostly dead standing trees, but sometimes live trees. So if you think about woodpeckers, they're excavating cavities into the trees and then nesting in them, and they usually only use them 1 year and then do a new one the next year. And lots of other species use that cavity then as their own nests. And so the woodpeckers wouldn't be able to do that, to excavate their cavity without some sort of fungal decay pathway in the tree. And
because otherwise the tree would be too strong for it to actually like get that deep in there. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So at least efficiently enough to make it worthwhile. So there's some, and it's different for every tree species, but there's some specific fungal pathway that creates the perfect kind of softness or hardness of wood for the woodpeckers, because it can be too soft also. And so there's kind of this sweet spot. And so what you'll see that they'll do is they'll start a bunch of cavities, and they'll find that one isn't good.
That spot that's actually like, okay, I can get deep enough, but it's not falling apart.
Yeah. Kind of so there's a lot of research now going on to take wood samples and figure out what fungi are in there, and try to identify the fungal pathways for cavity creation, for like optimal cavity creation. And so that directly relates to the species that I studied, since it's a cavity nesting species. And that's one of those things that, when you think about it, it's pretty obvious and easy to understand. But when you're walking around the woods and you see big dead trees with holes in them, you don't think like, oh, fungi, that's what did that. Yeah.
Do you think it's a white rot or a brown rot fungi that's making it sort of that perfect soft point.
So the data on this study was a bit inconclusive, but it suggested that Phamatopsis pinicola, is there a new name for that one now?
Yeah, there's all the Phamatopsis.
Whatever the new name for Phamatopsis is it Lorelle? Yeah, I don't know, but that was suggested to be a important fungal decay in woodpeckers like blackbacked and white-headed woodpeckers.
And as far as I know, that's a white rot, so it's digesting the lignin, which is like in wood you have cellulose is sort of these long strands, and then lignin is these like cross-linking molecules that gives wood its real structural stability. So if you degrade the lignin, then you have all the cellulose left, which is probably that sort of perfect soft point where they can kind of get in there and hollow something out, but the tree's still not falling over yet. So
yeah. Yeah, exactly. I hadn't thought about the white versus brown rot aspect of it, but that's a good point. One fun thing that was found in that same study is that they actually found rhizopogon in almost all of the cavities, and they're like, "What? That's weird."
Doesn't it usually live like in the soil, or it's like a mycorrhizal partner, and yet it's up here in the cavity?
Well, so based on one person's observation, they think that it's actually flying squirrels and rodents, which are cavity nesters as well. Yep. And a lot of those arboreal rodents are fungivores, and they really heavily rely on rhizopogon. So they think that they were actually carrying them up into the cavities, and these researchers are like, what the heck is going on here?
I mean, that's cool, because if you think about that relationship, so squirrels are digging up the little rhizopogon truffles, and that's pretty much the only time I've ever found rhizopogon is when it's been gnawed on by a squirrel. So they eat that, and they take the spores up into the tree. They poop them out in the tree. So the rhizopogon probably germinates or does something in there. And those are generally mycorrhizal, but I think most mushrooms have the capacity to grow at least somewhat as saprobes as well as mycorrhizal partners. So maybe it's turning on genes for infiltrating wood. And then eventually when the tree falls over, maybe it now has like a rich nitrogen source and mycelium base in the wood that can like integrate. I don't know. It's again, you're thinking about like things over time and a scale of time that's very different from what we assume. Human beings are pretty good at saying, okay, I saw this in the spring, so I can recognize this in the fall. And you get these sort of annual patterns. But if you sit down on the forest floor and you're like, okay, I've seen those time-lapse footage things from like Planet Earth, where you're like, okay, I can imagine the forest going through a whole season. But if you imagine just beyond a season and you're like, okay, what if 50 years, 100 years, what happens? Like trees grow up, they fall down, and there's so many more of those relationships that are there. And I think we need to be better at like adjusting our timelines and our perspectives to fully understand like what the fungi and the trees and the animals and all these things are playing parts in relationships that are so much broader and vaster than we even can conceive. And I think ecologists are, getting a handle on it, but it is pretty amazing that when you go out for a walk in the forest, like there's all of that happening around you constantly. And yet you think it's just a pretty day in the woods.
Yeah. It's happening on a much slower time scale. Yeah. Most of the work that I do in terms of habitat improvement and creation is on like a 50 to 100 year time scale, because that's kind of the time scale that forest management operates at right now. But then beyond that, you think about like wildfire regimes and fire return intervals, and that can happen in certain habitats, every 1,000, 2,000 years. And so when we see a fire in the Coast Range, we think, wow, that's so unnatural, but it's just kind of rare for our human lifespan, and we're not thinking about that broader time scale.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. Like disturbance ecology, like this year was very disturbing to see all that fire, and certainly very disruptive, and it had paid a huge toll. And it's frustrating to hear people say, "Oh, it's just a mismanagement issue," and you're like, "Well, clearly there's like more things at play, because the forest has been mismanaged for the past 70, 80 years kind of thing, and it is a lifetime thing. So it's not like management can't change within a year. It's not like we can just all go out to the forest with rakes and fix the problem. It's it is something that needs to happen over the course of our lifetimes. And within that, we have to recognize that there's, other disturbance factors. And there's a lot of disturbance factors that are coming in. That's not just fire. Fire is a fairly easy one to model. It's a lot harder when you have influences of stuff like, in California with sudden oak disease, the Phytophthora ramorum, which is just like mowing through all the tan oaks and completely changing the forest ecology. And then that's changing the way that influences what happens with fires, because now there's more kindling and substrate and stuff to burn, and like all of the influence of the invasive plants, which are creating so much more stuff to burn than the native plants. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone has any particularly good answers for this stuff, but it is all so much more complicated.
Oh yeah, it's so complex. And you know, I got asked my masters all the time, why should we care about this one species? You know, what's up with researching one species? And now I wish I knew this and had this answer earlier, but I'm realizing that if you learn the life history and the ecology of a single species, you inherently learn about some sort of complex system that might have been unknown or understudied before, because literally everything is connected, as cliche as that sounds. And there's all these just hidden species interactions and processes that even if you're studying one species, you're gonna eventually figure out all these other interactions. So, you know, why study one species? Well, everything's linked and it's all really complex, so we got to start somewhere.
And for me, like, you know, mushrooms are my starting point. I've always been a fan of nature, but usually I would just like hike seemed like just kind of an empty promise. I was like, what am I going to go for a hike and like just walk 12 miles? What's the fun in that? And as soon as I was like, oh, I can go out and find something which I can bring home and eat. Yes, I'm suddenly much more interested in this. And also usually mushroom hiking, you're not going 12 miles, you're going like a mile and a half and just walking around in circles for a long time.
Yeah.
But be going out and focusing on one thing, saying, I am going to go find porcini, I am going to go find morels or something like that. And suddenly you realize that I can't just go out and look for those things. I have to put myself in a matrix of decisions about what's my habitat, what's the time of year, what are the moisture conditions, what are the trees, what are the other indicator mushrooms, what are some of the species that might be here. And suddenly you go from just, hey, I'm looking for dinner, to being like a student of nature. And I was amazed how quickly I suddenly opened my eyes to the sort of the world of ecology, which I'd been thinking about in terms of like, you know, microbial succession in a wine fermentation, and suddenly was like, holy cow, I can expand this to the entire world. And my understanding of the natural world was just flipped on its head when I had to sort of recognize that there was this insane interconnected web of things. And I know it sounds kind of hippie-ish, but yeah, everything really is connected. And when you're in the woods and you spend time and you just sit there and listen or think, you start to see it.
Yeah, I was thinking about another example of, have you heard about the blue stain fungus and the mountain pine beetle and that symbiotic relationship there?
No. I know about the cryptoporous mushroom and the pine beetle here, but no, what's the blue staining thing? What's that?
So blue stain fungus and mountain pine beetle have a symbiotic relationship, so much so that the mountain pine beetle actually has specialized mouth parts that carry the fungus on it. Like
little pouches in the side of its mouth or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is. I'm curious. I'm going to look that up after this. But so the mountain pine beetle is digging its mouth parts into trees to feed off of the phloem, the sapwood.
Xylem phloem, yeah.
And inevitably it's inoculating the tree with this fungus. And this fungus and the mountain pine beetle actually work together to hasten the death of the tree, which benefits both of them. And the fungus actually reduces resin production, and resin production is the tree's defense against the mountain pine beetle. And the I guess because the fungus gets such a beneficial it's so benefited by being carried from tree to tree on the mouth parts of the beetle that it actually the beetle also feeds on the fungus too, and its larvae feed on the fungus.
So it's farming the fungus. The fungus is doing the work for the beetle, killing the tree. Yeah. Is it laying eggs in the fruiting bodies of the mushroom too? Or
oh, you know what? I don't think so. I think what happens is that the mountain pine beetle can't lay eggs in the tree without the fungus because of the resin. So it requires, and that's why it carries this fungus on its mouth parts to kind of create the habitat for its egg laying. But I don't think it is directly using the structure. But then to make this even more complex and link it back to what we were talking about before, so this tree dies then. And first of all, these are both native species in the Pacific Northwest. So
So it's not an invasive thing that's out of balance with the system. It's part of the natural ecosystem.
And it can't get out of balance with things like climate change and stress trees from drought. But historically, it's a native disturbance that is necessary in our forest succession. But so it's creating these dead trees so that woodpeckers can come in and create cavities. So then the Phaumotopsis, or whatever the new name for that one is, I'm going to have to burn that into my brain after this. The Phaumotopsis comes in and decays the tree, then woodpeckers come in, and then my purple martins come and nest. So it's just like this beautiful circular relationship.
That's so cool. And that's, you know, if you're in the woods and you're like, oh, look at that kind of cool bluish purple bird, you wouldn't think about that entire sequence of events that leads to that bird being there. But it is. And you need, and I guess what you're saying too is you need that natural disturbance for all of those things to go in succession. Because if you don't have that natural disturbance, you're then actually shutting down part of the the cycle that is supposed to naturally be happening. Which again is, go ahead.
On the flip side, really cold winters kill off a lot of the fungus and the pine beetles, and that keeps it in check. But with warmer winters now, we're seeing unnaturally high populations of bark beetles. And so on the flip side of not having enough disturbance, we're seeing massive outbreaks like in the early 2000s in British Columbia that are causing mass destruction of pine forests. So yeah, it's like this delicate balance that nature had figured out perfectly until recently.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if you've seen the new David Attenborough movie.
I just watched it 2 days ago.
Really brought home for me, I think we all know that, climate change, it's been a thing for our entire lives. They're like, oh, we need to save the planet. But it kind of really highlighted the fact that like climate change already happened. Our world was highly buffered and we blew right through that in the 20th century. Wildlife is gone, CO2 levels are up. Climate change is no longer arguable that it has happened. And now what we're looking at is full on climate collapse. Right. Is all of the forests of the world turning into kindling and burning, all of the green areas of the world desertifying. I mean, it is shocking and terrifying. And the fact that like in 10 years from now, all of the polar ice could be melted and our sea levels could, New York's going to be underwater. Like, I don't know why we're arguing about trivial things and issues that are not this thing that affects all of humanity. But
I think it has to do with that time scale, that perception of time scale thing, though. Like, and I like that David Attenborough really brought it home at the end with putting it in our generation's time scale to make it relevant to us. But I think a lot of people who aren't directly impacted, like I know that in Northern California, where you're directly impacted with all these wildfires. A lot of people are not experiencing that, and so they think, this is not going to happen in my lifetime, so I'm not going to. Why inconvenience myself? It's that, shifting your temporal scale.
Yeah. And I think the hard part is that people don't realize how fast things have actually changed, because for a long time they were changing fairly slowly because they were buffered. But now that we're looking at like the collapse of like the southern Arctic ice sheets and stuff like that, you're like, oh, wow, like something larger than the size of Texas is going to break off and float into the ocean and melt. And like, what is that going to do to our climate? So, I mean, it's scary. It's not, I think the hard part is it's not impossible. It's not that we're without hope. We are really inventive, ingenious, amazing species, but this is our planet now, and everything that is happening on this planet is our responsibility. So we need to take that responsibility and own it, because otherwise we're not going to be here that much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working on some long-term forest ecology studies and kind of wrangling the data right now. And one of the things that's been a shocking realization for me is how we no longer can predict the outcome of management options that seemed really easy to do 10 or 20 years ago. So for example, prescribed fire. So thinning and prescribed fire, immediately I'm like, oh, we need to prescribe burn more because that will help mitigate the risk of these catastrophic wildfires. And, you know, we need to do it because we've been suppressing fire. However, there are so many other factors at play now that you really can't just go in and prescribe burn without unforeseen consequences. And that's seen all the time. And so everybody's afraid to prescribe burn now at a large enough scale. And so just all these novel interacting situations like drought and increased mountain pine beetles and increased heat load. It's like, wow, we don't even know what's going to happen if we do any type of management. And so how do we choose what to do?
Yeah, it gets harder and harder to sort of find that path forward. And we feel, again, like we're back to square zero because we just don't understand. You know, we spent 500 years in science understanding how the natural natural world works. And in the last 50 years, we've shifted things so much that we can't really predict how things are going to go anymore.
Yeah.
But I guess, But what we can rely on in some ways is that there is small micro differences, and within our own climates, we will continue to have seasons. And although seasons may shift a bit, we can still somewhat count on the fact that there is an element of seasonality and hopefully the joys of the seasons that come along with it. Because I know you guys are in mushroom season up in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I'm curious and wanting to live slightly vicariously through what have you found recently? What are some of the things that, you know, I've seen your partner Dan has gone out and found like awesome, all sorts of cool chanterelles and lobsters. And, you know, I'm living very, very jealously down here in California because it's not wet yet. But what are some of the things that you're out there looking for this time of year and you're excited about? And I don't know, all the stuff.
So Dan is certainly out there much more than I am these days, but just this past weekend we found fib kings, the Boletus fibrillosus, and Cocora, which is an Amanita species. However,
do you like Cocora?
I brought it home, but I didn't eat it because I had a little moment of panic.
Amanitas are always worth being very cautious with, and
I know it's a Cocora, but I still just don't want to eat it.
I will say I found one last year, and because I'd found it a couple times before, never ate it because I chickened out, and then after eating a couple other Amanita species, I was like, okay, I'll try Cocora because people love it, and it just tasted like dirt and mud to me. So I was like, what's
interesting? So this one is one that is fruiting off of conifer. So I wonder if it's a different flavor profile. It seems like it would be.
Probably, yeah. Mine was in mud and dirt, and so it tasted just like that. And I was like, I'm pretty sure the ones I found in the woods with conifer and real duff would be tastier.
Yeah. But there's a lot of, have you eaten, I have some here. They're Xericomelus diffractus. It's a blue staining bully, but it's not a bitter one. And this one is the crackled cap bully. There's also the Zellers. And a lot of people don't like these, or I guess think that they're just super mediocre, but they're so abundant that, and they're kind of nice filler mushrooms or stock mushrooms that Dan just picked a bunch and I picked a bunch, and they're out in full force right now, along with the Cocoras. And, obviously lots of yellow Formosus and Subabetus chanterelles, the white chanterelles, Swillus, Gomphidius. Yeah, it's kind of a really good
early
time
season push. Yeah, it's good stuff. Do you eat any of those Swillus species, or?
I collect them and use. So I have I actually have some jars here just for fun. So
yeah, show them off.
I've got a jar of just rando mushroom species that I use for soup stock and whatnot. And so in here, there's like some mediocre lobsters and winter chanterelles and Swillus, and other boletes. And that's what I tend to do with the Swillus.
Yeah, just kind of like general mushroom stuff.
Yeah. I've tried a couple species on their own before, but I'm kind of one of the people that I don't need to try every species that there is. I would much prefer to eat the really tasty ones and then still utilize some of the mediocre ones because they have high nutritional value as filler or soup stock.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my first sort of experience when I was living in New Zealand back in like 2017, and I was like desperately trying to figure out what stuff was, and that was when I first got on Instagram, was like, oh my God, I have to follow accounts like, you know, Rachel and Mycelia and just try to figure out like what am I looking at. And one of the first things I found was some Xerocamelus species,
Hmm.
and I was very nervous about should I eat these or not, and inevitably I ended up drying them out in an oven. And first thing I did was sort of use them as stock mushrooms, and really enjoyed them. I was like, wow, this
Hmm.
has great porcini bolete flavor. It's fantastic. When I
Yeah.
finally got around to eating some of them fresh, I was like, okay, it's a little underwhelming. It's kind of a mushy texture, and I think people love boletes so much because they have that meaty texture. So when you have this kind of fibrous, insipid thing, you're like, okay, I get why it's not, a big deal. But drying it, it's as good as any other bolete for the most part that I've tried dried.
Yeah.
Um, and I've had this similar experiences with Suillus too, that there's been some Suillus that I really enjoyed eating, particularly ones I had in New Zealand. They were like super buttery and super great, but a lot of the ones
Interesting.
here are they're
Yeah.
gooey. They have a slightly weird flavor and stuff like that, but they're great dried, and they add a lot of texture and flavor to soups and stocks and things like that. So
Yeah. Yeah. Why not use them? If you know what it is, why not use it? Although I say that and I didn't eat the Kokora, so
I try. That always happens to me. That inevitably there'll be like one mushroom I bring home because I'm like, I'm going to be brave, or there's something exciting, and I found this, and I want to try it, and then I'm like, well, I also brought home a couple pounds of shanties and some other things. I'll eat
yeah.
those first, and by the time I get around to being like, okay, I've psyched myself up, I'm ready to eat this thing. You take it out, and it's just like liquefied in the bag or like in the fridge.
Yeah.
Oops.
That'll
Um,
happen. Yeah, Dan brought home the other day 2 tables full of porcini. And so, we're finding these Serracamellis and we're like, yeah, we're just going to dehydrate these because there's enough
yeah,
porcini for the next
getting
week.
enough good stuff. Have you found any Matsutake yet, or?
I personally have not. I know that they're out. I tend to, so I actually hunt Matsutake in the sand dunes on the
Hmm,
coast in the shore pine.
interesting.
And so I actually haven't really keyed into their mountain habitat yet.
Hmm.
And I'm just starting to learn that from Dan this year, but I've always picked sandy Matsutake. So, and that happens here later, more, a little bit later in the season than the mountain ones do.
Okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm like, for me in California, I like where I am in Napa because I have access to like the coastal habitat. I can go a little further north into Mendocino or Humboldt and get up into like really, really prime coastal habitat. But I have sort of internal valley oak chaparral around me here, which is great in like January, February kind of thing when there's lots of rain. Then I have access to the mountain habitats up in the foothills and Shasta. And so California is an amazing place to go and sample all those habitats. But as I've been exploring particular places and mushrooms there, I'm learning again, like we talked about, so much more about those habitats and caring so much more about these ecosystems than I ever thought I would before. What kind of access to the habitats do you? Because you mentioned having multiple habitats. What are you going to look out at? You have sand dunes and forests and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, when I first moved to Oregon, I actually moved to the coast. I lived in Bandon, Oregon, which is right on the coast. So I am really familiar with the sand dune habitat out there and the marshy saline wetlands and whatnot. And I actually was really unfamiliar with the Cascades
Hmm.
until just a couple of years ago. I was more in the Willamette Valley, which is
Mm.
drier. There's oak woodlands and oak savanna, the Coast Range, which is really wet and just brushy, and then the sand dunes. And so just now I'm starting to become more well acquainted with the mountain Cascade habitat. And I grew up in Pennsylvania, so we didn't really have any big mountains there either. So it's kind of like a
Yeah.
whole new challenge for me.
Yeah, it's amazing at how different those things can be, and how like even the same mushroom in different habitats be fruiting with different trees, and so your visual cue for those things is so different. And I know that for me, I found Matsutake here in California primarily under tan oak, and then
Hmm.
last year I bounced up to Oregon and was exploring around Mount Hood and was finding it under pine, and I was like, I'm looking for very different things, even though it's basically the same mushroom. I think even possibly the same species. Um, Although I think that in some ways we should like start to rethink how we define fungal species again, and same with yeast, because there seems to be a lot of like interplay in species groups and sensu stricto and all this kind of jazz.
And not even just fungal species. There's so much hybridization and weird things happening in birds and plants. And I think like the human need to bin everything and categorize it kind of gets in the way of it oversimplifies how things actually work.
That exact term is one of the things I always try to describe to people when I'm talking about mushrooms and fungi and nature in general. Is everything we have an understanding of is basically an oversimplification, right? Because we pluck things out of nature, we look at them intently, and we isolate them and do all this stuff, and then say, okay, well, here's all the properties of this. And you're like, yeah, but you looked, all the properties you judged of this thing you did in a lab in isolation. What if you put it back in context? How do you understand it in context? And then when you look at, it's not just a single species, maybe it's this gradient of a population. And there's all these slight different inputs given the environments and the other players in the environment that affect the behavior and the characteristics of it. And suddenly you realize that our understanding of biology is so reductive and simple and oversimplified, and that we're missing so much. Like we keep talking about, if everything was connected, and if we keep disconnecting things and then trying to understand it, it's like, it's not going to work, Yeah. It's like looking at a light bulb without electricity. You're not going to get the true purpose of it.
That's a good example. I like it.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
I wanted to ask you though, before we veered off, if you go black trumpet hunting often, and if so, if I end up in Northern California in the next few months, in several months, I guess.
Yeah, it's still, I've been out to the coast a couple of times recently, and it is still very dry. It was like, there was more moisture on the coast in the middle of August than there is right now, which I was sort of frustrated by, because I was like, I'm driving like 3 hours. I really hope I find something. Nope, nothing. I guess I've had some Dyer's polypore. That's consolation prize for being out there. I definitely have access to some good Matsutaka and black trumpet spots. I know, there is some areas where you get a lot of that like winter trio. So certainly like later into like February and March, you'll find a lot of the hedgehogs and the yellow feet and the black trumpets. But like I talked about, that tan oak habitat is threatened because the sudden oak death is moving through a lot of places, and I think we're seeing a drastic loss of tan oak habitat. And I'm, fingers crossed it's not going to come all the way through, some of my favorite mushroom hunting spots. But with the movement of a lot of humans, especially around the Bay Area, where there's a lot of sudden oak death in, particularly around like, Oakland, and I see a lot in one of my local parks here. And I fear that when I go up to the coast, I might be trekking that thing with me. And so it's one of those things to like always be aware of, like, hey, you should clean your boots when you go from habitat to habitat. And, if you're walking around,
tires off or something.
Yeah. When you're walking around, I don't know if other people have visited like dairy production facilities or something like that, or a lot of like pharma places that I've been to. When you go from room to room, you have to like decontaminate yourself just to go from one room to another, and just like keeping that same sort of thing in mind as you're going from habitat to habitat is a good one. It's not always easy to do, but like you carry a little bit of like bleach and some water around a little like shoe thing in the back of your car, you could probably help the environment and do something good. So
with a lot of fungal pathogens like the white nose syndrome with bats too. I mean, I guess we should all be carrying bleach bottles around with us.
It's the sad truth of it. I mean, and that's partially because we as human beings have kind of broken what is nature, and everything is somewhat limited in the sense of like it can only go as far as that organism can go. And with birds, you see birds are global organisms, but a lot of things are fairly local in that they disperse their seeds and whatever in a localized area. Whereas we as human beings are just completely plowed through that with our technology. So, and that's part of why the pandemic is an issue right now, because if we didn't have global air travel, we wouldn't have a pandemic. We would have a localized disease in part of China.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's interesting, but I guess I'm curious about all the stuff that you find, because you are so much more than mushrooms, and so much more about foraging. And like just the first time I went out with you and you were like pointing out all of these lichens and edible plants and other things, I was like, holy cow, I have a lot to learn, so much to learn. And one of the things I really appreciate about watching your stories is not just the information that you're providing, which is phenomenal and interesting and engaging, but what you do with it afterwards is the preparation, the preservation, importantly, and then the preparation. Can you talk some about like your favorite ways to find stuff, and I don't know, just beyond pickling, or you know,
Yeah.
what else do you do?
Well, so Dan and I really kind of fuel each other, or each other's fire, and inspire each other to just get completely crazy with
With the
cooking wild
food, yeah,
foods. So
yeah.
I don't know that I would have gotten so into it without his presence, but and I owe a lot of my knowledge to him. But we've just been fermenting everything, pickling everything, but dehydrating, smoking. So I know what Dan recently did was cold smoke lobster mushrooms and chanterelles, and then grind them up and make powders and salts out of them. And it's just bonkers. The smell and the flavors, it's really, really great. And something as simple as just starting your own fermented soda, where you go on a hike and you collect some pine branches or some fir needles and maybe some berries or blossoms. Maybe throw some lemon slices in there and raw honey, and you let it ferment for I think 3 days. And
So you get some bubbles, basically.
you get this really tailored, beautiful, kind of reminiscent of your hike drink that is good for your microbiome, and it took little to no effort, and every time you make it, it's different. So we've been having a lot of fun doing that pretty regularly. And I also I know you said other than pickling, but I
Yeah,
do.
no, but I mean, pickling is great too. And there's 1,000 different ways to pickle stuff too.
Yeah.
Are you lacto fermenting and pickling? Are you, there's salt brines and.
Well, I've just been kind of trying to pickle random stuff together. So I just did rose petals with red onion for the color, but also the rose petals themselves now on sandwiches and whatnot are really, really delightful. And so just kind of just experimenting and trying whatever, and you sometimes get really gross fermentation products.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're amazing.
Yeah. Do you have the Noma fermentation guide? Has that entered your life yet?
I've heard of it. I don't have it myself. I wonder if I should ask that for a Christmas present.
It's a very good Christmas present. Yeah. Renee Redzepi and David Zilber, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Those guys, they did it was years and years and years of work and development. They had this barge where they were just doing, all these different ferments and a lot of stuff with foraged foods. And it was just it's a compendium of knowledge and interesting stuff. But a lot of the food I see you make is very reminiscent. Not even necessarily that you're inspired by them, but just when you start foraging and you start fermenting and you start trying to figure out what to do with this stuff, I get the sense and I get the sense very much from your cooking that you cook kind of like I do, where people are like, wow, this is so intricate. And you're like, well, I just had an array of ingredients and I tried to use all of them in a dish. And that's why it seems so crazy. It's not like I had some really high level concept. I was literally just trying to figure out how to eat the stuff in my fridge.
Yeah, totally. Half the time it's like, well, we have a little bit of this left in the jar. Where does this fit in?
Yeah. What would this pair with? And
yeah, the ingredients list is so long and people are like, you're ridiculous. And it's the same, I think I've even said that to you before. Like, wow, you cook ridiculous food. And you said the same thing. I just had it all and I just threw it all together and it turned out pretty good.
I literally had some leftovers and I just threw that on top of this other thing. So it was I cooked 3 or 4 meals sort of compounded together, and that's why the ingredient list is an entire page of text. But
yeah, it's pretty fun.
It's a good way to eat too, because honestly, that's what they do in restaurants. In restaurants, they often are flipping one stock into another stock, and components get recycled, and that is how you achieve that depth of flavor and complexity. And nutritionally, I think that's a great thing too, is going out and foraging and finding these components is adding new types of polysaccharides and sugars and proteins and new antigens to your body that ideally are helping to strengthen your immune system. So you're not just eating, gluten, eggs, and soy all the time. It's, the main allergens that people are becoming sensitive to is because they're probably consuming too much of it. You eat the rainbow, you will feel better. And again, I know it's a hippie concept, but it's so true.
Yeah, and you get some of that good bacteria, and that helps boost your immune system and whatnot.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, and it helps. I think it feels a little bit more sustainable because you're really kind of cutting down on food waste
Hmm.
and supplementing your diet with things that aren't supporting mass commercial farming, which is hard to avoid completely in our lives. But yeah, I try to supplement as much as possible with these natural foods, especially invasive species, because you
Yes.
can you can harvest an invasive species and you're helping like 5 different situations. You're helping your gut health, you're helping your immune system, you're helping the invasive species problem, you're helping
You're having the
cut down
species that
food
are
waste.
being impacted by that invasive species. Yeah,
Yeah,
you could be saving a bird or a squirrel or something you didn't even know was affected by whatever ecological relationship is happening.
sure. Yeah.
Um, so, and I guess with that in mind, I was going to ask about, I think one of the things that people leverage a lot if they see you out mushroom hunting or they see you foraging, they're like, well, that can't be sustainable. Human beings aren't supposed to take stuff out of nature. And you're like, well, nature for a long time has always had a buffer such that animals can come and consume and take small amounts kind of thing. And we as human beings are often recapitulating the animals that would have naturally been doing something because we've sort of changed the ecology of our entire planet. Um, so with that in mind, are there like sustainable foraging practices or
Oh
anything that
yeah.
you I mean, speak to that. Tell me about it.
Yeah, totally. I think that it's really important to study the habitat, not just with hunting mushroom species, but with any plant species, to not just know how to identify it, but to know what type of habitat and environment it grows in. And then you
Mm,
can make informed decisions about when you should and shouldn't be harvesting any, or, how much of a certain plant. But generally speaking, I use a 15% rule. And that could be 15% of an individual plant or 15% of a whole patch of plants.
mhm.
And that is for like native species that are not sensitive or threatened. If something is sensitive or threatened, don't mess with
Yeah,
it.
just don't eat it.
Because you're theoretically, if you're out foraging, you're for plants that are sensitive, you're not it's not for sustenance. It's maybe more for the enjoyment factor of it. But yeah, so the 15% rule is generally what I tell people, and what I try to stick to, unless it's an invasive species, in which case feel free to harvest as much as you want, with the caveat, no, you have to know that certain invasive species, you can actually, if you don't properly harvest, you can actually promote growth or
Mm.
spread the species.
So yeah, cutting like at the root or cutting at the stem versus the root kind of thing. So you don't want to accidentally propagate more of something.
Exactly. Yeah. Certain plants really easily propagate, and that's why they're so invasive. So,
Yeah.
like Japanese knotweed,
Yeah.
don't leave all your clippings out in the forest like you would with a mushroom. Put it in a plastic bag, or somehow burn it. I don't know. Somehow dispose of it that is not promoting spread of that species. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, really just kind of before harvesting, pull your phone out and do a quick search. If you don't know what the plant is it a sensitive status species in your area? Um, if not, then 15%.
What are some of the foraging resources that you use, out in the field?
I tend to use lots of plant and tree field guides, and I do a lot of internet research at
Mm.
home. And there are clearly countless Instagram accounts that just blow my mind with their use of different wild foods, like Mallory O'Donnell and the Medicine Circle, and just really pushing the game. But I tend to be the type of person that just takes my plant keys out, and then going out, if I find something that I'm not sure if it's edible or not, I'm not going to pick any of it. I'm going to do my research. I usually have my phone on me, and do some research, or come home and take a deep dive into that species before I really get into harvesting and cooking it.
Right. And it's okay, like you said, with a kokora to occasionally like take something with the best intentions and then just be like, I'm gonna put this in the compost because I'm not ready for that risk yet. But don't take a
Yeah,
whole bunch of it if you're not ready. Just take one and then decide, what you're feeling about it. But there's no reason to push yourself to eat something that you're not sure about because
absolutely.
it's always a
That's a
good idea
good
to just
point.
play it safe.
Yeah, if you have a weird gut vibe, you should usually go with that. Your gut
Yeah.
usually is feeling weird for a reason.
And that's another great thing is, you can try these wild products But always trying a small amount is a good idea. And I know even, some of the things that I've seen you eating, you're like, hey, this has oxalic acid, which if you eat too much of it will make you quite sick. And people are like, well, oxalic acid's toxic. And you're like, yeah, but it's also in kale and spinach and
Yeah,
all these
like
vegetables.
apples have arsenic. Yeah.
We're constantly eating things that have all these toxins in them that are present in wild foods at the same level, basically. So just be aware and limit your portion size. And, you don't need to go out and eat an entire salad bar worth of the forest and then you get a tummy ache.
Totally. And knowing how certain things interact with predisposed conditions you may have. For example, with that example, if you have had kidney stones or your family has a history of kidney stones, you should know that things with high levels of oxalic acid are probably not a good idea for you, and they might be perfectly fine for everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. That sort of human interaction and your own gut microbiome and all these things have, you have your own internal ecology. And in some ways, like the slowness of the forest that we see, and we're like, okay, I have to really slow down my expectations and think about things. That is the complete opposite end of the spectrum for the bacteria that live in your gut, because those things happen very quickly. You're like, I ate a cheeseburger for lunch, and suddenly I just felled all the redwood trees in my stomach, and now I've got invasive species all over the place because I ate a cheeseburger. It happens that fast. You're like, oh, my tummy feels kind of weird. You're like, well.
Wow, I just imagined a whole redwood forest in my stomach.
Well, high fiber foods and fruits, vegetables, beans, mushrooms, meat's good, dairy's fine, just like everything in balance. And I have my own sort of nutritional philosophy that's started working for me, but I think everybody's got to figure out their own balance.
Totally.
Although I do think eating mushrooms is a good thing to do, and forage foods help add some of that complexity and some of that newness and just fun.
New flavor profiles, new nutrients and vitamins, new microbiome, bacterial microorganisms, all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of which, people are often asking me, hey, how do I get into foraging? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm not really a forager. I'm just kind of an uber nerd with an iPhone who takes pictures of mushrooms. You should talk to real foragers. And you would certainly be one of the people that I'd say, hey, Lorelle's a real forager. And not only is she a real forager, she's actively trying to teach people.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your website and your classes and some of the projects you have going on?
Yeah, totally. So I just launched my own business, which for me, it's really just trying to connect people with nature and educate people. But I have been teaching foraging classes with Wildcraft Studio School based out of Portland. I decided to kind of, in addition to that, go off and do my own thing so that I can offer more private one-on-one classes or more classes that are tailored to whatever you want. And so I've been offering a very small number of group classes. I just had a mushroom class this past Sunday. And I'm also doing private one-on-ones, which could be anything from, so I'm doing one that's in the intertidal zone on the coast, and it's going to be seaweed and barnacles and how to harvest those sustainably and then how to cook them. And then I also have a mushroom hunt scheduled.
Gooseneck barnacles? Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a whole background in marine biology and scuba, and we should talk about that next time we chat.
I didn't know that. That's cool. Yeah, we should talk about the whole intertidal zone.
Super cool.
Yeah. But then I'm also doing a mushroom class for somebody, but we're doing a large component of cooking and processing at the end. So going out and picking, and then what do you do next? How do you cook each different species of mushrooms and preserve them in different ways? So yeah, I'm really
and maximize their flavors and textures. I mean, there's so much that goes into it, and I'm like constantly learning myself every time I get a new batch of something. Like, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
How do I make it taste better than the last time?
Right. Or I'm getting sick of pickled chanterelles. What else can I do? Yeah. But so yeah, I'm offering those classes. My website is lorellemorel.com. I also just started doing Forest Ecology Fridays, which is really fun for me. And I've been getting some positive feedback, which means I'm going to keep doing it. And my goal there is just to present some really basic foundational background information on forest ecology and forest management, because I know with all the recent catastrophic wildfires that have happened in the Pacific Northwest in California, people are really interested and they feel a little bit lost maybe. And so in order to make good decisions, you got to know the basics. And so tune in on Fridays. I usually do a whole series of stories and then save them to my highlights. But that's another way to learn more about the forest, not foraging specific. I'm also always open to people just messaging me if they find something and they want to know what to do with it. I'm totally open to that.
Yeah, I love that too. It's fun to interact with people, and I love getting feedback from people because you're getting real-time phenology reports. People are like, "Hey, I'm here and I found this," and you're like,
Yeah.
"Cool." It's good to know that that's fruiting down there because I can make a guess about when I'll see it in my habitat or something like that. So
Absolutely.
it's
That's
lots
a
of
great
fun.
point.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly where we are in the hour, but I think we're getting near the end. So thank
Mhm.
you so much for joining me, and it was a real pleasure to see you and get to chat. And I don't know, next time I'll make it up to Oregon, but certainly if you guys make it down to California, you are
Yeah.
welcome. I will show you all. I mean, I don't have that many great spots, but I'll show you what I got.
I am much
So
closer to you now, so I think a visit is in the near future.
cool. I think sometime in November I may head up to Oregon too. So
Okay.
I'll let you know when I'm heading that direction, and
Yeah,
hopefully we can meet up and do some mycophile fun. But
absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on here, Gordon. I
yeah,
appreciate
it's good to see you.
it. You
Have a good one.
too. Bye.
Bye.